Do you worry about making mistakes? It feels like the whole world is coming to an end. Or worse, will be exposed as a fraud. How many mistakes can you make while piecing a quilt? Quite a few, it seems. I made so many while making my Sugary Doo Quilt-along quilt. Stick with me and I'll show you how I did them. So I have been receiving a lot of comments lately from viewers who are so worried about making mistakes they can't even start a project. Or because blocks are not perfect, they have unfinished projects lurking in their closets. Mistakes happen all the time, and everyone makes them all the time. And just to show you how often they happen, I'm going to walk you through all the mistakes I made while making my Sugary Doo Quilt-along quilt and how I fixed them. So the Sugary Doo Quilt-along started way back in November 2019. I had two goals for myself in the Quilt-along. I wanted to use linen for the first time, and I wanted to pre-wash all my fabrics and try that method for the first time. It was a mystery pattern, which means we didn't know what the final quilt would look like before we started. We just had a general idea. And I made a video about quilt-alongs with 10 tips on how to make it to the finish line. So right out of the gate, I made a mistake. When making my fabric choices, I thought I would have my warm red at the top and rainbow down to a cool purple at the bottom. I cut my fabric according to the directions, I pre-washed it, and then I changed my mind. With a more critical eye, I realized that I could move the cool purples to the top, and that would balance out the low value blues on the bottom, and put the highest value yellow in the center. But since the rows had different fabric requirements, that meant that some colors would not have enough fabrics, and other fabrics would have too much wastage. I decided to go forth and deal with it as the problems arose. My second mistake was in the very first row, number 5 hashtags, and I grabbed the wrong color. It might have been because pickle is one of my favorite colors, but I should have grabbed the amber. I could have recovered by shifting the deep purple from the top and putting it on the bottom, but I didn't realize my mistake until after I completed the deep purple row. So my around the corner row is above my hashtags and not below.
My third mistake was also on hashtags.
Some of the pieces I cut the wrong width, and I was short 1/4 inch on this block. I decided to wait till all my rows were complete, then decide whether I was going to fix the pieces or I was just going to trim the whole row.
In the end, I ripped it all out and pieced it again.
Except I did it wrong a second time.
The third time through, I finally got it right.
And then the entire row wasn't quite wide enough. So I used those wrong strips on the side to widen my row.
The fourth mistake was on the fourth row called This Way, and I made it out of Kona Tiger Lily.
My row was so short, it was only 68 inches. I guess I must have ran out of steam or something. I dug into my scrap bag and found enough scrap strips to make my row longer.
And for some reason, my row was too wide, so I took the opportunity to trim it up. Mistake number 5 was made on row number 3, cross stitch, made from Kona wine.
My row was short by a good 1.5 inches. So again, I dug into my scrap bag and found some leftover strips and plugged those in on the sides.
The next mistake was on row 2, out of the box.
Now I really blew the mulberry row. Remember my first mistake when I rearranged the fabrics? I didn't have enough fabric for the cutting directions provided, but I thought I was clever enough to do a workaround. Unfortunately, when I cut it the next day, I totally forgot to do the alterations to the pattern and I cut it all wrong, all of it. So in my stash, I did have more of the fabric, but I wasn't about to wait around while I pre-washed the fabrics and waste everything that I had cut. So I decided to make a somewhat different block. But instead of the diagonals, I made wonky log cabins. It's not amazing, but I can live with it because the contrast in the block is not high.
The 7th mistake was in the 7th row, called Down and Up, made with Kona lime.
So with half the quilt put together, I realized I made a mistake in my highlighted block distribution, which meant that I needed to move my highlighted arrow block to the middle, which was no big mistake, just a visit with my stitch ripper, and I sewed them back on. But I have been looking at the quilt upside down. The deep purple should be at the top of the quilt. And when I turned the whole quilt around, my arrow was pointing downwards, which I did not like. So I flipped the row and had to move one more block.
And now I can see I'm a bit short on the width, so I need to find some strips to add to the sides. My 8th mistake was in the 8th row, called Mowed Lawn, and I made this with Kona clover. I made this row
in the summertime while I was waiting for my son's CAT scan results. At least that's my excuse for miscounting and making an extra block. But it was simple work just to remove it.
My 9th mistake was in the 10th row, ... made with Kona Caribbean. I made this row too wide.
And my highlight block was in the wrong spot. So I shifted the blocks and I tightened up 3 blocks by 1/4 of an inch. And when it was still too long, I tightened up 3 more.
My 10th mistake was made in my 11th row, all together now, made from Kona Celestial.
I'm not quite sure how I made this mistake, but I missed 2 pieces in the background. When I posted a picture on Facebook, another quilter mentioned it, and I could not believe that I'd made such an obvious error and did not see it. So the stitch ripper came out again, and I corrected that one. These are not the only mistakes that I have ever made. One of my first videos was about the 5 beginner mistakes that I made when I started out. I have spun blocks around. I have sewn wrong sides together. Just last week, I sewed 3 pieces together instead of 2. When I was making the quilt in my video, What's in the Blue Bag, my batting became all twisted, and I had to make a double cut through the batting to flatten it out. I've had to cut off points to make blocks square. I have cut fabric wrong and didn't have any more to cut it right, so I had to sew it back together again and then cut it correctly. Some mistakes I didn't even notice until the quilt was finished. And these are just the mistakes that I can remember. Mistakes happen. It's not a matter of if, but when and how many. But it is so very rare that you cannot overcome them, or that they are as obvious to others as they are to you. And the story of how you persevered just becomes part of your quilt story. And when you look back at that quilt in years to come, you'll realize that mistakes were just part of your journey, and it's one that we are all on. And now the rows are all sewn together. It's amazing how it works anyways. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will notify you when I make new videos. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Just Get It Done Quilts. And of course, subscribe to my newsletter at justgetitdonequilts.com. So take care, and I'll see you next time.